Hello everyone. Dear students, in this video we are going to talk about the do's and don'ts of writing a research article. We already have a video which is the first video of the series on research methodology, in which we talked in detail about writing each section of a research paper. So in this video we are going to assume that you have already watched that video and you have already produced your first draft of the research article. And in the last video, we assumed that you have already conducted your experiments, you have got the results, and we just talked about writing the different sections of your research article. So in this video, since you already have got your first draft, so we are going to look back into it and see whether we have got it according to the standard, and we are going to fix certain problems that we might have in our first draft. Another thing that I want to talk about is generally I assume my audience to be from the computer science background, and when we talk about research articles we assume it to be quantitative research because that is normally what we do in computer science. There is qualitative research, but most of the time it's quantitative. In quantitative research we again have different types. For example, you may come up with a completely different technique with a completely different algorithm that adds to the body of knowledge. But that kind of research is very rare. It takes a lot of time. You are not sure of the results, and that is not what generally students go for in their first few papers. So most often we see research produced in application-based approaches or framework-based approaches. In application-based approaches, a technique that is already introduced and is doing so well, for most of the problems we try to consider a real-world scenario in which their technique may not be performing up to the mark. In that case, we do some modifications in their approach which makes that approach appropriate for the scenario that we are considering. Now, the scenario that we are considering may be the one that is having input as a stream. It may be the one that has high-dimensional data. It may be the one with outliers. So whatever the specific scenario we assume, the approach or the technique that we are using, which is doing so well, may not be performing up to the mark, and we basically want to do some little adjustments in their approach that would make it appropriate for the scenario we are picking. The third type is a framework-based approach in which the different components that we are going to use are already introduced and are doing well in their specific areas, but they aren't being arranged in a specific order to do a task that you are doing for the first time. So you are introducing a framework in which all the components that you are using are already introduced by other researchers, but they haven't been organized or arranged in a specific order that you have introduced as your framework and are not used in such a way for a specific problem. So that would be a framework-based research article or contribution. Of course, the first type, that is the theory-based, is the most dominant one and is considered as breakthrough in the research area. The other two are of relatively lesser impact. However, they are more manageable in a fixed time frame. So to reiterate what I said, most of the time when I'm talking about research, I might be considering quantitative research and more specifically application-based research articles. Now, the next important thing to consider is the audience of your research article, that who is going to read your paper so that you may write it in a way that could be more absorbing for them. So the first threshold that you need to pass is the editor and the reviewers before your paper may reach the actual audience. So what an editor sees in a paper is whether it is in accordance with the interests of the journal. So if you are submitting to a journal or a conference and your paper is from one of the subtopics of their journal or conference, so that is what basically the editors are interested in. They may also briefly scan the paper whether it is in accordance with the standard formatting and writing requirements of that particular journal or conference. Once it goes through the editor, it's being passed on to the reviewers. The reviewers study the paper in detail and come up with comments that are going to decide whether the paper is going to be accepted, rejected, or need to have modifications. Very rarely a paper gets accepted without any modifications, so most often one should expect the reviewers to have their comments as modifications that they would want to see in that particular paper, which should be gratefully accepted. So when a paper meets the expectation of the editor and the reviewers and you modify according to the suggestions of the reviewers, the paper is published, and that is when it reaches the real audience, that is the people who are interested in your research. So from a writing perspective, your main approach should be to write a paper that is acceptable to the editor and the reviewers. From there on, once the paper is published, you have two types of audience, where one is the general audience or the researchers who are from other domains. These are the people who are reading about your paper in order to learn about this new research area. Or they may already have been introduced to this area and they are exploring it further. Now for those audience, introduction is the main part, and that is going to grab their attention. If your introduction is well written and is clearly mentioning the problem, the solution, and the results, so that is basically going to make it very easier for them to understand this specific problem that you are working on, and they might be more interested in reading the rest of the paper. The relevant audience who are from the same domain and already have a good research background are probably the ones who may not be that much interested in the introduction, because it is something that introduces the big picture, as we discussed earlier in the previous video also, that you go from breadth of knowledge to the depth, and they must be very much aware of all that. So what they are more specifically interested in are the state-of-the-art approaches, the problem that you have identified, the technical details of that problem with respect to the existing approaches, and how you are addressing their problem. So this audience may skip the literature, they may skip the introduction, because that would be very much overlapped with what they frequently read in most of the papers, but they are particularly interested in those technical details and then how you back that with the results and discussion. So the technical part of the paper is specifically for this audience. Next, we discuss the content of your paper. And here I would like to comment on few things that you should have in your research article. And the most important one in that is to provide as more detail as possible. Explain each step of your algorithms, explain each variable of your equations, what they are doing, what are the minimum and maximum values, how the value changes. Explain each block of your diagram, explain all the details in your figures and tables. Now this may get more than what is required, but you may want to do that rather than having lesser details, because you do not know beforehand what level of detail a reviewer is expecting. Now, in case a reviewer is expecting more detail and they write it in their suggestions, and you receive those comments after 2 or 3 months when you have already moved on and now you are working on different new projects, it would be a lot more difficult for you to get back to a paper that you have written 2 or 3 months back and now to run new experiments and to add more detail into it. Rather, let the reviewer cut down the details from your paper, and that would be a lot more easier for you to do at the later stages. At this point, when the experiments and everything is fresh, so you can provide more details, but it's going to be a lot more difficult at that stage. Now, in writing content, the next important thing is to use the academic phraseology. Now, in research, when you are comparing different techniques, when you are introducing a new topic, when you are identifying the limitations or issues in a specific type of techniques, there are specific phrases and terms used for that more frequently. And for researchers like us who are not native speakers of English, we generally get into trouble when we try to explain the things in our own words, which generally may not be according to the academic standard. So, one important thing is to look into the academic phraseology. There are different resources available that you may look into how to write about certain things when you are writing a research article. Secondly, once you have read your first 20 or 30 papers, on a specific topic, now you might see the introduction and the literature review getting overlapped and reproduced over and over again. This is the stage where I would like you to still continue reading the introduction and the literature, not from the perspective of understanding their domain, that you already do so, but this time from the perspective of how the writer is presenting the idea, how they are comparing different techniques, how they are identifying the limitations of a technique. So be more focused on how the idea is presented rather than the idea itself. And focusing on that from paper to paper, you are going to learn about the different ways in order how to present a specific idea. And then you may make use of it with your own words, and that is going to take care of this specific problem. Another important problem for us non-native speakers is the following mistakes in writing that we generally do, even if we already have published some papers, but still each time we write, we tend to get these type of mistakes. Grammatical, typographic, sentence construction. So in order to tackle with this problem, the only thing that we have to do is to read the paper over and over again, not in a single sitting, but multiple times in different times of the day and on different days, in order to get a different perspective each time we read the paper. And with that, we are going to identify more and more technical writing issues in our paper. We should also provide it to our colleagues or friends who are from the same area so that they may read the paper, and then we may have a discussion in order to see whether they are getting the same points in the same way as we are trying to express them. And that is also going to help a lot to have a reader's perspective. Another common problem that we would try to avoid is having long sentences. As the sentence gets longer, there are more chances that it may not make a clear sense and the reader may get confused. So each time you see a sentence getting into multiple lines of your article, try to break it into 2 or 3 sentences. We should not write in passive voice at all times, and we should not use first, second, or third person. So when we are writing about our own contribution, instead of saying that I propose this or we propose this, we should rather say the proposed approach. The same way if you are discussing someone else's contribution, so instead of saying he or they, we should just write the approach in such and so paper. So we should try to avoid the first, second, third person as much as possible. The next important thing to consider is using the same term or word for a concept over and over again. Now in general writing, that is in essays, etc., we try to use as much vocabulary as possible, and in order to make that writing more appealing. And for that purpose, we use different synonyms for referring to the same thing over and over again, because the repetition of the word is generally not considered good in that kind of writing. But in academic writing, if you are referring to something with a specific word, try to use that word consistently throughout the document for referring to that same thing. Do not try to use different synonyms for referring to the same thing, because that is going to cause confusion. The next important thing to discuss is the flow of your article. So as we start, we must present the breadth of knowledge, and as we go down the sentences in that section, we should get more specific and in-depth to the target approach. So the sentences should be in a sequence and in relevance with each other, and the same way the paragraphs should also be in a sequence with each other. Now again, this thing can only be ensured if you already have the article written. So you may read through the article and make sure whether you have these issues, whether there are problems with the flow, with phraseology, with sentences, and you may want to fix them. Now, a specific problem referring to the flow would be that I have started my discussion with classification, then I talked about the different sections of classification, and then I have moved on to discuss the k-nearest neighbor classifier and its different variants, and all of a sudden I have made a comparison with clustering. Now that is a complete break of flow. Where does clustering come from? If I haven't discussed it in the breadth, then I should not introduce new concepts halfway through the document. If it is relevant, then I should make a reference of it at a much higher level rather than introducing newer concepts which do not fit into the flow halfway through the document. And as we are converging from breadth to depth, we are bound to follow a specific path or approach in comparison to the rest. And at each such point, we should provide arguments that is going to help the reader understand why we are proceeding with a specific type of approach and exploring it further and not going on with the other types of approaches. So that is also very important in understanding the flow of the article. And finally, we should not go backwards as we go from breadth to depth. For example, if I have discussed classification, from there I have moved on to instance-based approaches for classification. From there I have moved on to the k-nearest neighbor approach. So once I have started writing about the k-nearest neighbor approach, I should not write a sentence about the instance-based approach or the classification, because we have moved on from there. Whatever I was supposed to say about classification in general, I should have said it earlier, and once I have moved on to the instance-based approaches, now I should not say anything about classification, and it should be more specific to the instance-based classification. And the same way, if I have moved on to k-nearest neighbors classifier, I shouldn't be writing about the instance-based classification and should be more specific to the specific type that I have moved on to. So these are the common issues that we frequently have in our first, second, and third draft, and we should reread it as much as possible to identify these issues and fix them. This slide particularly talks about the discussion on results, which is very important that you provide the arguments that why you are obtaining such results. It shouldn't be by chance that has no explanation, but rather you have explained your proposed work in detail, that why the modification that you are making is going to solve this problem. So the same way, you need to provide those arguments that how it has helped in improving the results, because at times the discussion on results may be more important than the results themselves. So just getting good results is not enough, and rather you should provide solid justification for those results. At this stage, you have written your paper and you have modified it in multiple parses, and you believe the content is very much ready to be submitted. So now just cross-check formatting of your paper for the last time and be sure that everything is consistent. Formatting should be checked to the minute details, because a paper that is very well formatted and the formatting is consistent is going to leave a very good impression, and in fact it's the first impression that the editor and reviewers are going to get of your paper. For example, if you are having tables in your paper, make sure that the table is not going out of the outlines of the paper, the text is not touching the borders, it's clear and readable. If you are having numbers, their units are provided. In case of figures, label your X's, use different patterns for different types of techniques. The font family that you are using within the graph should be the one that you are using in the paper, so that the two are consistent. Make sure the figures are not breaking when you zoom in on it, and make sure that the figures are also clear and meaningful in printout. If you are using minor color differences between different approaches, they are going to look very much the same on a printout. So rather we should use different patterns for the techniques in a graph than using color only. And finally, my recommendations are to use a dendrogram for your literature survey. That is the big picture of all the literature that you have covered in this work. And that is a very clear roadmap for you how you are going to proceed with writing your research article, or just to cross-check whether you have written it in exactly the same way. And it's also very meaningful for the reader. My next recommendation may not be possible for all types of research. However, you should give it a thought and see if it is possible. And that is to demonstrate your problem with the help of a sample problem. So, for example, if you are performing sentiment analysis on a big data set with millions of tweets, can you represent the problem in state-of-the-art approaches with 4 or 5 tweets that you may easily demonstrate? And if it is doable, it should be placed after the literature review. That is, in the end of the literature review, you have identified the problem and now you are giving a demonstration that how the current approaches are not addressing the problem that you have presented. So if you could do that with the help of a demonstrative example where you consider a few sample tweets, process them with the existing approaches and show how the problem persists. And if possible, you may also demonstrate your proposed solution that with the same set of tweets, how your approach is going to address that problem. So that is basically solving the problem on a smaller scale, and that may be very helpful for the readers to understand the problem and the solution and cross-check the values of that small sample on paper and see how the problem is and how the solution addresses it. Finally, to conclude, I would say don't try to make it right the first time, because you are not going to do so. It's going to take many parses and many reads until it reaches a point where it should be submitted. Reread it over and over again at different times of the day, on different days with different frame of minds, so that you may identify the problems that you may not have seen the previous day. And as I said earlier, you may also provide your paper to your friends, colleagues who are from the same area and have their feedback on your write-up as well. So the more perspectives you have on it earlier on, the better it is and the more it's going to save you time. Don't try to rush into fixing your paper and submitting it because you are going to get lots of reviews and suggestions from the reviewers after months. Rather, you should spend a month extra on it at this end and get fewer problems identified in your work, and that is going to save you a lot of time. So those were my recommendations for improving the quality of your article from one draft to the other before you should submit it. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching.